She thought she locked her door that night, but she didn't. That single mistake, that tiny slip in routine, opened the way for a nightmare no one in her town was ready for. And what hurts the most is this. While her body grew cold on a living room floor, the person responsible walked around Grand Rapids as if nothing happened. He smiled at neighbors. He raised kids. He lived a normal life while Laura Middleton's future ended before it had a chance to unfold. Laura wasn't some stranger passing through town. She wasn't the type of person people forget. She spent her days restoring damaged art, helping preserve local history, giving her time to a community she loved. And yet, on a freezing night in December 1972, her kindness and calm life meant nothing to the person who stepped through her door. Ask yourself something. How is it possible that a respected 71-year-old volunteer would one day be let out of his home in handcuffs, accused of a murder committed almost 50 years earlier? How does a man who spent decades helping others end up tied to one of the most painful crimes Grand Rapids ever faced? That question is why people still talk about this case. It's why some residents still refuse to walk alone at night. It's why a city that prided itself on safety had to face the truth that danger isn't always loud. Sometimes it waits quietly. Sometimes it smiles at you. Danger hides in quiet towns. If this happened near you, wouldn't you want warnings fast? Subscribe now. And if you won't, tell us in the comments why. Before we go any deeper, before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The morning Laura didn't show up for work, people thought she was sick or maybe stuck in the snow. No one wanted to speak the fear they felt. Not her friend Sylvie, not her clients, not the neighbors who saw her lights still on long after sunrise. People hoped she was resting. They hoped she overslept. They hoped for anything except the truth waiting inside that apartment. The door wasn't kicked open by police. It wasn't broken or smashed. It opened easily, too easily. What they found inside shook even the toughest hearts in the city. Laura was on the floor, her belongings scattered, furniture pushed out of place, and the kind of violence no one wants to picture had taken her life. There was no robbery, no ransom, no warning, just pain. A woman who worked so hard to protect history became a memory no one knew how to carry. Grand Rapids changed that day. People locked their doors twice. Parents pulled their kids closer. Women stopped walking home alone. Everyone kept asking the same question. Who would do this to her? But the hardest part wasn't the murder. It was the silence that followed. Even detectives admitted the case hit them in a way they weren't ready for. They had leads, but none stayed solid. They had questions, but no answers. The person who entered her home left almost nothing behind. It felt like the killer walked in, destroyed her life, and walked back out without a trace. Like he knew exactly what he was doing. And while Laura was lowered into the ground, the person who ended her life carried on like nothing happened. Her family begged for answers. Her friends prayed the truth would show up in their lifetime. But the case file gathered dust, and people slowly learned to stop asking questions because the pain was too much. Some moved away, unable to walk past the street where she once lived. Others stayed but avoided her block completely. Something about that apartment door haunted people. It reminded them that any ordinary night can turn into something you never escape from. Detective Vargas, the man who led the case in 1972, carried the weight longer than anyone. He retired with the same file still sitting in the back of his mind, the same photos burned into his memory, the same fingerprint that told him the killer had been close enough to touch that door, but still walked free. He admitted years later that Laura's case was the one thing in his career that never let him rest. But the hardest truth came from the community itself. People started assuming the killer must be dead, or far away, or locked up for something else. They told themselves whatever they needed to feel safer. What they didn't know was this. The person responsible wasn't far at all. He wasn't dead. He wasn't missing. He was living in the same region, working, volunteering, shaking hands, building a calm life while Laura's name sat frozen in an old folder. He heard updates about the case on the news. He walked past people who still whispered her name. He lived like someone who believed he had gotten away with it forever. For nearly half a century, people walked past Victor Albright without a second thought. He volunteered at community events. He waved at neighbors. He lived what looked like a calm, steady life. To most people, he was harmless, ordinary, forgettable. But time doesn't erase truth. It waits, it watches. It sits quietly until the right moment arrives. In 2019, that moment finally came. New investigators reopened Laura's case and pushed her file into modern systems. For the first time in 47 years, her evidence spoke louder than fear, louder than excuses, louder than the silence that protected the wrong person. The partial fingerprint collected in 1972, the same fingerprint that detectives once said was too incomplete, suddenly matched someone in a national record, someone unexpected, someone the community trusted. At the same time, new DNA methods linked microscopic material from Laura's struggle to the same family line. Every clue pointed to one name, Victor Albright. When officers approached his home, they weren't just carrying a warrant. They were carrying 47 years of anger, 47 years of unanswered questions, and the weight of a woman who never saw justice in her lifetime. The arrest stunned the entire region. How could a man who helped at charity events be the same person who took Laura's life? How did he stay calm through every anniversary of her death? How does someone carry a secret that heavy for almost 5 decades? But nothing investigators did in 1972 could prepare them for the truth waiting 47 years later. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Detective Alonzo Vargas had seen difficult scenes before, but the moment he stepped inside Laura Middleton's apartment that morning, something inside him tightened. The living room felt frozen in a moment of pain, a knocked-over table, a lamp on the ground, a book she never finished reading. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was the end of a life filled with quiet purpose. Vargas stood still for a long moment, taking everything in, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. His team began their sweep. The first thing that stood out was the back door. It showed signs of forced entry, not reckless, but firm, quick, as if someone knew exactly how to push their way through without wasting time. On the door frame, officers found a partial fingerprint. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean, but it was the only real trace the intruder had left behind. The second clue came from Laura's carpet, a few thin strands of wool, torn from some kind of thick winter clothing. Not clothing she owned, something the person who fought with her had been wearing. Outside, the sky hung low, heavy with December cold. Snow pressed against the windows, muting every sound. Neighbors stood outside with stiff faces, watching police move in and out. Some cried, some stared straight ahead, refusing to look anyone in the eye. A peaceful street now felt tense, like someone had scraped all the safety out of it. Detective Vargas asked everyone nearby what they heard the night before. Anything unusual, any strange sound? But answers were thin. It was winter. Windows were shut. People were asleep. No one saw anything useful. Still, Vargas kept pushing. Something told him this wasn't random. Someone came here with purpose. Someone came here knowing Laura would be alone. But he had no name, no direction, only a fingerprint that didn't match anyone in their small database. And the first wave of failure was already settling in. By midday, Vargas began the most painful task, speaking with the people who knew Laura best. He needed answers, and he needed them fast, even if every conversation felt like reopening a wound. The first person he met was Sylvie Dubois, Laura's closest friend. Sylvie's hands shook as she tried to recount the previous night. She told him about the gallery event, how Laura laughed, how she spoke about going home to relax. Sylvie kept apologizing, blaming herself for not walking her to her car. Her voice cracked when she said, she seemed tired, but happy. Nothing felt wrong. Vargas didn't interrupt. He let her talk until she had nothing left to say. And still, nothing she said pointed towards someone who wanted Laura harmed. Next was Pierce Alastair, her ex-fiancé. He had moved away after their breakup, but old connections made him a necessary conversation. When Vargas reached him, Pierce sounded stunned, hurt, almost afraid. He had been hundreds of miles away on the night Laura died, with proof, a solid alibi, plane tickets, witnesses. Vargas checked everything twice. The man was telling the truth. Whatever problems they once had, this wasn't one of them. With every cleared name, frustration rose. The clues didn't add up to a person, they barely added up to a direction. That winter afternoon, Vargas walked the street outside Laura's building. Snow coated the sidewalks. Cars moved slowly. People whispered to each other, eyes filled with the kind of fear that lingers long after police tape is removed. A city that once felt calm now carried a quiet tension. A question pressed into everyone's mind, even though no one dared say it out loud. What if the person who did this was someone they knew? And even worse, what if he was still walking among them? As hours turned into days, the investigation felt like pushing against a wall that refused to move. Vargas kept returning to the fingerprint, the only trace left by the intruder. In 1972, fingerprint databases were small, limited, and slow. The print was entered, but not a single match came back, not even a close one. It was like the person who touched that door had no history at all. The wool fibers found on the carpet were sent to the state lab, but testing methods at the time couldn't point to a specific person or even a brand. All they could say was that the strands came from a thick, high-quality coat. Thousands of people owned coats like that in Michigan winters. It was another clue that led nowhere. With no one to question and no fresh leads, Vargas sent officers door to door. Some residents answered nervously, clutching their jackets. Others kept glancing over their shoulders as they spoke. Even the calmest homes felt tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. A pattern interrupt hit the investigation hard. Nothing changed. Street after street gave the same answer. No, officer, we didn't hear anything. It was too cold. Our windows were shut. At night, Vargas went home carrying the weight of every failed attempt. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the case file, asking himself the same question over and over. What am I missing? Have you ever sensed something was wrong but no one believed you? That's how Vargas felt. Every instinct in him screamed that the answer was close, painfully close. But he had nothing solid enough to chase. And with each passing day, fear settled a little deeper into the community. People began to assume the killer would never be caught. They had no idea the truth was already sitting inside that file, waiting for a future no one could see yet. By the end of the first week, the case felt like a heavy cloud hanging over every corner of Grand Rapids. People were tired, angry, afraid. Parents stopped letting their kids walk anywhere alone. Store owners closed early. Neighbors kept checking their windows, wondering if the person who ended Laura's life was still watching them. Inside the station, Vargas sat at his desk long after everyone else went home. He flipped through every page of the file again and again, searching for something he might have missed. But every page told the same story. A woman lost, a trail that vanished, and a killer who seemed to move like smoke. He replayed Sylvie's words. He replayed Pierce's alibi. He replayed every detail from the scene, hoping something would click. But nothing did. The partial fingerprint sat there, useless. The wool strands sat there, useless. Every tiny lead refused to open a path. Cold cases aren't declared in a single moment. They fade, they slow down. They start to feel like you're fighting a shadow you can't catch. That's what happened here. Not because Vargas didn't care, but because the investigation hit a dead wall no one could break through with the tools they had. And yet, somewhere in that stack of papers, something important was waiting. Something quiet. Something small enough to be ignored in 1972, but strong enough to expose the truth almost 5 decades later. No one knew it, not even Vargas, but the clue that would one day destroy the killer's freedom was already sitting in the file, sealed in a box, waiting for a world with better tools and better science. The city tried to move on. The police moved on. Even time moved on. But the truth didn't. The days after Laura's murder slowly turned into weeks, then months. Each passing moment felt like a reminder of how quickly a case can fade from the spotlight. At first, the community stayed alert. People asked questions. People talked. People worried. But fear has a strange way of settling, and over time, it becomes background noise. That's what happened in Grand Rapids. By the end of the first year, Laura's case had shifted from urgent to uncertain. Tips slowed down until they stopped entirely. People who once claimed to remember something suddenly had nothing left to add. Neighbors who once watched every stranger now went back to their routines. The winter chill that once made the city tense became just another season. But Laura's family never forgot. Her mother kept her daughter's art supplies untouched in a room she refused to change. Her siblings kept asking detectives for updates even when they already knew the answer. There was nothing new to report. Every anniversary felt like reopening the wound. And for Detective Alonso Vargas, the silence was almost unbearable. He tried to put the case aside, but every time he saw a locked door or heard a story of someone walking home late, something inside him twisted. He couldn't shake the thought that the person responsible was out there, free, calm, blending into the world like he belonged in it. As years rolled by, the file grew colder. Leads died, witnesses moved, forgot, or passed away. Whatever trail once existed had vanished completely. The frustration in the police department was real, but the disappointment in Laura's family was worse. It felt like the case wasn't just unsolved, it was disappearing. As the years stretched into a full decade, Laura Middleton's name moved from news headlines to quiet footnotes in old archives. The fresh pain that once gripped the city settled into something dull and tired. People stopped expecting updates. New crimes took attention. New worries replaced old ones. It's painful to admit, but the world kept moving while her case stood still. But the people closest to Laura didn't have that luxury. Her mother aged with the weight of unanswered questions on her shoulders. Friends who once shared art supplies and long conversations carried guilt they could never shake. Some blamed themselves for not insisting she stay with them that night. Others blamed themselves for not noticing anything strange earlier. Pain has a way of rewriting memories, and for them, every memory hurt. Detective Vargas was no different. He watched the case slip through his fingers year after year. Each time a new officer joined the force, he hoped fresh eyes might spot what he couldn't. But each time the result was the same: disappointment. Every attempt to revive the case collapsed before it even gained momentum. No suspects, no movement, no new evidence. Eventually, Vargas retired. He took home a box filled with old reports from cases he solved. But Laura's case wasn't in that box. It stayed in the archives because it wasn't finished. And Vargas never stopped thinking about it. He once told a colleague, "How do you fight a ghost?" It was a question that never left him. The emptiness surrounding the case wasn't just silence. It was failure, stretched across decades. And the killer? He lived without fear, without guilt, without consequences. By the 20-year mark, Laura's case had become the kind of story people whispered about only on cold nights when memories felt sharper. Some residents barely remembered the details. Others weren't born yet. Time replaced fear with distance, and distance slowly turned into silence. The tragedy that once shook the entire region was now something people spoke of only when someone pointed at the old apartment building and said, "That's where it happened." But for Laura's family, the calendar was a constant reminder. Every birthday, every holiday, every winter. They carried the same ache year after year, the ache of knowing her killer lived an ordinary life while they were forced to live with a hole that never closed. The few detectives who revisited the file over the decades always hit the same dead wall. The partial fingerprint led nowhere. The wool fibers meant nothing on their own. The case had no surviving eyewitness, no solid tip, no confession, no sudden breakthrough, just darkness. The emotional weight of the failure, it grew so heavy that some officers quietly admitted they believed the killer had escaped justice forever. Others feared the truth was worse, that he might still be nearby, ying normally, blending into everyday life. The city itself changed over the decades. New buildings, new faces, new problems. But the file stayed the same. A thin folder that held a story no one could finish. Would you still want answers after 47 years? Most people say yes, but living through that kind of waiting is something entirely different. What no one knew, not the police, not the family, not even the man responsible, was that the smallest slip he made on that winter night would one day return to destroy everything he built. By the time the case crossed its 30th year, it had become one of those files that younger officers barely glanced at. They weren't there in 1972. They hadn't felt the shock, the anger, the fear. To them, Laura's case was just another aging folder buried under dozens of newer tragedies. That's the cruel truth about time. It doesn't slow down for the people who need answers the most. For Laura's family, every decade hurt more than the one before. They knew the world had changed. They knew technology was advancing. They kept hoping someone would take a fresh look someday. But hope is heavy. Carry it long enough, and it starts to feel like punishment. Detective Vargas lived out his retirement with a quiet sadness. He would sometimes sit alone on his porch, thinking about the case he never solved. He carried guilt for years, believing he had somehow failed Laura. What he didn't know was that the tools he needed simply didn't exist yet. His instincts were right. The killer wasn't a stranger. He wasn't far away. He wasn't gone. Dead ends piled so high over the decades that it became impossible to see beyond them. The case didn't just slow down, it turned into silence. A silence so deep that most people assumed the truth would stay buried forever. But the truth doesn't stay buried. It waits. And on that night in 1972, the person responsible made one tiny mistake. A mistake so small, no one recognized it for nearly 50 years. A mistake that sat quietly inside an old folder, untouched, unnoticed, but strong enough to destroy him once the right eyes finally saw it. The past wasn't finished. It was only waiting. In 2019, long after most people accepted Laura Middleton's case as a closed chapter in local history, the Grand Rapids Police Department launched a new initiative, a cold case unit focused solely on forgotten files and unanswered tragedies. Fresh officers, fresh tools, fresh determination. Among them was Detective Lena Costas, a sharp-minded investigator with a quiet fire in her chest. The kind of person who refused to ignore unfinished stories. She found Laura's case in an old storage room, dusty, unopened for years. Before touching anything, she stood still, absorbing the weight of a woman whose name she had only seen in old reports. Something about the file made her pause. She flipped through the pages, noticing the same frustration repeated from decade to decade. Dead ends, lack of evidence, unanswered questions. But Lena didn't see a dead case. She saw potential. She immediately sent the original evidence to the state lab for modern testing. The fingerprint, the wool strands, every scrap of material stored since 1972. Back then, labs didn't have enough technology to do anything meaningful with them. But now, techniques were different. Databases were massive. Science had expanded in ways investigators from the past could only dream about. The partial fingerprint was the first to be revisited. Specialists scanned it, restructured it, cleared the grain noise, and fed it into the national database, something no one could do decades ago. Lena waited, hands folded, heart steady, but hopeful. Hours later, the screen flashed with something the case had never seen before. A match, a real match. For the first time in 47 years, the fingerprint pointed to a living man, someone who had once been arrested on a minor charge, leaving behind prints that now linked him to Laura's doorframe. The past had finally cracked open. The match from the fingerprint was only the beginning. Detective Lena Costas stared at the screen, feeling a pressure in her chest that was half excitement, half disbelief. After decades of silence, the case finally moved. But one match wasn't enough. She needed more, much more. She pushed for full DNA testing on every preserved sample taken from Laura's hands and clothing. Back in 1990s, this material was impossible to analyze properly. Today, even the smallest trace could reveal something powerful. The lab worked day and night, using techniques that didn't exist when Laura died. They pulled a faint but usable profile from what little remained under her fingernails, a sign she had fought back. The DNA didn't match the fingerprint directly. Instead, it opened a different door. The genetic profile pointed toward a distant cousin, someone who had uploaded their test results into a public genealogy site years after the murder. That cousin had never met Laura, never knew the case existed, but their DNA was close enough to guide investigators toward a specific family line in Michigan. Lena and the genealogist spent weeks building out the branches. Dozens of names, line after line, birth records, marriage records, addresses, mobs, every possible connection. And slowly, a pattern appeared. A small group of relatives who lived in Grand Rapids during the early 1970s. One name kept repeating. One name sat at the center of the map. One name refused to fade away. Victor Vic Albright. A man with no violent record. A man who had lived quietly for decades. A man whose face appeared in old community photos, smiling like he belonged everywhere. Lena's heart pounded as she circled his name. She didn't have all the evidence yet, but every clue was pointing straight at him. It was time to dig deeper. Once Victor Albright's name surfaced, Lena refused to rush. She knew that after 47 years of waiting, they couldn't afford even a single mistake. She built a full profile around him, where he lived, where he worked, who he knew, and what his life looked like in 1972. She discovered that at the time of Laura's murder, Victor had lived less than 15 minutes from her apartment. He worked odd jobs, came from a large family, and blended in easily. Nothing about him stood out. That made him even more unsettling. People like that don't draw attention. They slip through gaps. They live in the spaces no one looks at long enough. Lena pulled his old records. They weren't dramatic. One minor arrest from decades ago, nothing violent, nothing alarming, but it was enough to place his fingerprints in the system. The same prints now linked to Laura's back door. Her stomach tightened as she stared at the comparison image. Same patterns, same ridges, same identity, but she still needed more. She tracked his job history, his movements, his addresses. Every detail painted a picture of a man who never left the region, never drew suspicion, and lived comfortably within the same community he once terrorized. He raised children. He attended local events. He volunteered. The idea that he did all this while carrying a secret that deep made Lena feel a mix of anger and disbelief. The deeper she dug, the clearer the pattern became. His timeline in 1972 lined up perfectly. His location matched, his access matched. Even small details, clothing, winter habits, routes, lined up with the evidence. Piece by piece, the quiet life he built over decades crumbled under the weight of the truth. Victor Albright wasn't just a name anymore. He was the center of the storm that had waited too long to break. With the fingerprint confirmed and the genealogical link tightening around one family line, Detective Lena Costas reached the moment she'd been working toward. She spread the documents across her desk. Old photos, timelines, property records, the DNA chart, the fingerprint match, and the notes she'd taken while studying Victor Albright's life. A single family tree stood out, and every branch, every connection, every clue kept circling back to the same man. Victor Vic Albright, 71 years old, grandfather, volunteer, neighbor, a man people trusted for decades. Lena stared at his photo, a harmless-looking older man with soft eyes. If she didn't know better, she would have thought he was someone who baked cookies for local fundraisers, not someone tied to a violent act that took a woman's life. That contrast hit her hard. It made her angry. It made her feel protective of a woman she had never met. She imagined how many times he walked past people who had spent years grieving Laura. How many times he shook hands with families who believed he was a kind soul. How many times he stood in the same places where people cried over the case he caused. That was the moment the fear-based CTA belonged, tied to the emotional punch. He hid for 47 years because nobody was watching. Don't stay in the dark. Subscribe. And if you still won't, drop a comment explaining why you'd take that risk. But even with all the evidence stacking up, Lena knew she couldn't make an arrest yet. She needed one last piece, something undeniable, something that would close every gap. Without it, the case could fall apart again. What she didn't expect was that the final proof would come from a place no one imagined, a place that would change everything. But to arrest him, detectives needed one final piece, and it would come from the most unexpected place. Detective Lena Costas knew she had to move carefully. The evidence pointed straight at Victor Albright, but the final step, confronting a man who had lived quietly for nearly half a century, required precision. Before anything else, she needed to see how he lived now, who he spoke to, where he went, what kind of life he built while Laura's family spent decades trapped in grief. Surveillance began early in the morning. Officers sat in unmarked cars near his home, watching a house that looked peaceful on the outside. A small porch, a trimmed yard, lights that came on at the same time every night. It was the home of someone who looked harmless, someone who blended into any quiet street in America. But inside that house lived the man whose fingerprint sat on a door frame from 1972. Detectives watched his routine closely. He woke up early, made coffee, greeted neighbors with a gentle nod, and walked to the community center where he volunteered. People smiled when they saw him. Some even hugged him. The officers had to force themselves to stay focused. The contrast was sickening. He wasn't acting like someone with a violent past. He was acting like someone who believed his past was buried forever. Once the surveillance logs confirmed his movements, Lena submitted the request for a DNA warrant. She explained the fingerprint match. She explained the genealogical link. She explained the timeline. When the judge signed it, the room felt heavy. After 47 years, someone finally had the authority to put the truth in front of him. The plan was simple. Wait for him to step out of his house at his usual morning time. Move quickly. Leave no chance for confusion or escape. The trap was set. The morning chosen for the confrontation looked like any other. Cold air, quiet streets, and the kind of stillness that makes everything feel heavier. Officers took their positions before sunrise. Unmarked cars lined the edges of the block. Engines off, windows slightly lowered. Lena sat in the closest vehicle, eyes fixed on Victor's front door, her breathing steady but tense. They didn't want chaos. They wanted clarity. They wanted control. At exactly 7:14 a.m., the door opened. Victor stepped outside wearing a winter jacket, holding a travel mug, ready to start another day he believed would be ordinary. He walked down his front steps, unaware that his life, the life he built, the life people trusted, was seconds away from collapsing. The officers moved fast. Victor Albright, stop right there. He froze. The mug slipped from his hand and hit the ground with a soft thud that seemed too small for the weight of the moment. His eyes widened, confusion spreading across his face. He looked from one officer to the next as if trying to understand whether this was some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. Lena stepped forward, badge visible, voice unwavering. She explained who she was. She explained the warrant. She explained why they were there. As the words left her mouth, Victor's expression shifted from confusion to fear, then to something that looked like denial. I don't understand, he whispered. This is wrong. But nothing was wrong, nothing except the lie he had lived for nearly 50 years. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound cut through the cold air. Sharp, final, unforgettable. Across the street, an elderly neighbor stepped outside and saw the scene. Her jaw dropped. She covered her mouth with both hands as tears filled her eyes. A friendly old volunteer. A murderer hiding in plain sight. As officers led Victor toward the patrol car, the entire street felt frozen. Not from the condemnation, but from shock. Curtains moved as neighbors peeked out. Doors cracked and opened. People who had known him for years stepped outside wearing looks of disbelief, as if their eyes couldn't accept what they were seeing. One man whispered, "Not him. No way." Another shook his head, stepping back like the ground underneath him no longer felt steady. This was someone who shoveled sidewalks for elderly neighbors, who helped carry groceries for strangers, who volunteered at the community center without expecting anything in return. People trusted him. Kids greeted him. Adults relied on him. The idea that he could be connected to a killing from decades ago didn't fit the version of him they thought they knew. Victor kept repeating the same phrase, "This is a mistake. I didn't do anything." But his voice trembled. It wasn't steady. It was breaking. Lena watched him closely. She had seen genuine confusion before. This wasn't that. This was a man realizing the past he buried was finally catching up to him. His hands shook. His breathing quickened. His eyes darted around as if searching for someone who would defend him, someone who would argue on his behalf. No one did. The moment the car door closed behind him, something strange happened on the street. A sudden silence. No footsteps, no whispers, no movement. It felt like the whole block was holding its breath, trying to process the truth. That's when the emotional shift hit hardest. For 47 years, he lived free. Laura didn't. Her life stopped at 30. His kept moving like nothing happened. And now, for the first time since that winter night, justice was no longer a distant dream. It was finally within reach. When Victor was taken into custody, the ride to the station felt heavier than the cold air outside. He sat in the back seat staring at the floor, saying nothing now. The earlier denial had faded. His shoulders slumped. His breathing was uneven. For the first time in nearly 50 years, he wasn't in control of the lie he'd lived behind. Inside the station, officers processed him while the community began to react. News spread fast. Phones rang. Social media lit up. People who once shared coffee with him or greeted him at weekend events asked the same painful question. How could someone like him do something like that? Shock turned into anger. Anger turned into disbelief. Disbelief turned into grief all over again. Parents hugged their children tighter. Old residents who remembered 1972 cried for Laura as if the tragedy had happened yesterday. Even younger people who weren't alive back then felt the weight of it, the idea that someone capable of that kind of violence walked among them for decades without raising suspicion. Meanwhile, detectives prepared for the next steps. The DNA warrant had been executed correctly. The fingerprint match was solid. The genealogical connection was strong. But they still needed one last confirmation. The final link that would remove any doubt and close every escape route. Lena watched Victor through the small window of the interrogation room. He sat hunched over, hands clasped tightly, eyes unfocused. He didn't look like the man neighbors had known for years. He didn't look gentle or harmless. He looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment without realizing it. Justice wasn't complete yet. But the walls around him were closing in. What came next would reveal everything. The interrogation room was silent except for the steady hum of the overhead light. Victor Albright sat alone at the table, his hands clasped together as if he were holding on to something only he could feel. His face looked drained, almost hollow, as if the years he'd hidden behind had caught up with him all at once. Detective Lena Costas entered the room with a folder thick enough to end any doubts. Her expression was calm, steady, almost solemn. She wasn't there to argue. She wasn't there to yell. She was there to present the truth that had waited 47 years to be heard. She placed the fingerprint comparison chart on the table first. The print from the doorframe matched perfectly with the print from his decades-old minor arrest. Victor stared at it. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He barely breathed. Next came the fibers, the wool strands collected from Laura's apartment in 1972. They were now linked to a winter coat style widely sold during that period. Victor owned a coat from that exact brand, confirmed in old photographs and purchase records. Then came the genealogy report, the distant cousin whose DNA pointed investigators toward Victor's family line. A chain of connections built through science he never imagined would exist. Finally, Lena laid out the timeline, where he lived, where he worked, how close he was to Laura, his movements during that winter, the routes he took daily, routes that placed him near her apartment the night she died. None of it was random. None of it was guesswork. Every piece fit together in a way that left no room for doubt. Victor's shoulders slowly sank. His eyes dropped to the table. He looked like a man who finally realized the world he had built around his lie was collapsing. There was no shouting, no dramatic outburst, just the quiet weight of truth. Outside the interrogation room, the station felt tense. Officers who had worked other cases walked by slowly, glancing through the small window as if they needed to see for themselves that the man inside truly existed. Some shook their heads. Some whispered about how long he lived freely. Others stared in disbelief, unable to reconcile the gentle older volunteer they knew with the evidence gathered against him. Inside, Lena continued laying out the truth piece by piece. She presented records showing Victor lived near Laura in 1972, Within a short distance of her apartment, she placed maps, old era addresses, and archived photographs on the table. Everything created a clear picture of his proximity to her on the night she was killed. The timeline left no gaps. The routes he walked matched the paths investigators believed the intruder took. It wasn't speculation, it was alignment. Victor didn't deny the evidence out loud. He didn't argue or push back. He only sat there with a look that belonged to someone trapped between the life he pretended to have and the one he had actually lived. When Lena stepped out of the room briefly to consult with her team, she walked into a hallway filled with officers who wore the same expression, a mix of anger and disbelief. Not because they wanted him to be innocent, but because the idea of someone hiding behind kindness for nearly 50 years felt like a betrayal to everyone who trusted him. News of the arrest spread quickly. Phones buzzed, messages poured in. Reporters stood outside the building, trying to confirm what they had heard. But the most painful moment came when word reached Sylvie Dubois, Laura's closest friend. The shock nearly knocked the breath out of her. When she learned the truth, she dropped into a chair and covered her face with both hands. She didn't cry at first, she just sat there shaking, unable to process the idea that the man responsible had walked among them for so long without anyone seeing the danger. When Sylvie Dubois finally let the truth settle in, the pain hit her all at once. For years, she carried guilt for not walking Laura to her car that night. She carried guilt for every unanswered question, every memory that felt unfinished, every moment she wished she could change. Learning that the man responsible had lived a quiet, friendly life among them felt like a second betrayal, one she didn't see coming. She cried in silence at first. Then the sadness turned into something sharper, something closer to anger. Not at the police, not at the city, but at the idea that someone could carry such a heavy secret with no sign of remorse. Across town, other residents reacted the same way. Some felt sick, some felt furious, some felt ashamed that they never suspected him. One older neighbor who remembered the night Laura was killed said she felt like she lost her breath twice, once in 1972 and again in 2019. People weren't just shocked by the arrest. They were shaken by what it meant. It meant trust can be broken quietly. It meant kindness can be a mask. It meant safety isn't always what it looks like. Meanwhile, inside the station, Lena returned to the interrogation room. Victor still hadn't asked for a lawyer. He still hadn't looked up. He sat motionless, as if every part of his strength had drained away the moment the evidence hit him. Lena didn't push him to speak. She didn't need him to confess with words. The truth was already laid out on the table. The fingerprint, the fibers, the genealogy, the timeline. Everything pointed to him. Everything connected. This was the moment the entire case had been building toward. Decades of waiting, doubt, and pain were finally colliding with the truth. Time protects no one. Truth is patient. In the hours following Victor Albright's arrest, the truth began to settle across the city like a weight people didn't know how to carry. News stations replayed footage of him walking into the police station with his head lowered. Comment sections filled with disbelief. Families gathered in living rooms, staring at their screens, trying to understand how someone they walked past so many times had been living behind such a terrible secret. Inside the station, detectives finalized the evidence summary. The table in front of Victor held everything he had tried to outrun. The fingerprint he left on Laura's door that winter night. The one detail that stayed hidden in that file for decades. The wool fibers that linked to the style of coat he owned. The genealogy chain that narrowed the search to one family line. The timeline that placed him near Laura's home at the exact window of time she was killed. These were not guesses, not theories, not assumptions. These were facts, built piece by piece over nearly 50 years. Victor's silence was no longer confusion. It was acceptance. He didn't ask to see the reports. He didn't try to argue. His shoulders remained heavy, his breathing slow, his eyes locked on the table, on the life he had tried so hard to erase. For the detectives, there was a moment of stillness, a long, quiet realization that the truth had always been within reach. It just needed the right tools, the right timing, and the right eyes. The curiosity loop that carried this case for decades finally snapped into place. The clue hidden in the file was the partial fingerprint from day one. The same print that once led nowhere would now bring an entire city the closure it had waited almost half a century to feel. When the truth finally came out, the city of Grand Rapids felt something it hadn't felt in nearly half a century. Release. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't joy. It was something quieter, something deeper, something closer to relief mixed with sadness. People walked the same streets they had walked their whole lives, but now they carried a new understanding. Danger doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it blends in. Sometimes it smiles at you. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. The case reminded everyone of something important. Hidden evil often looks ordinary. It doesn't always wear a threatening face. It doesn't always stand out. It can blend into crowds, attend local events, and help with charity drives. It can wave at neighbors and unlock doors for strangers. And while it does all that, it can still carry the weight of something unforgivable. Families across the city began to talk about Laura again, not just about the tragedy, but about the woman she was. They talked about her kindness, her love for restoring art, the way she protected history one painting at a time. Her story became more than a case file. It became a reminder that cold cases matter, that forgotten victims still deserve the truth, no matter how long it takes. And as detectives and residents reflected on everything uncovered in 2019, one message echoed across the community. Technology gives victims a voice long after their lives are taken. Laura didn't get the chance to speak again, but the science that didn't exist in 1972 stood up for her when she could not. Her legacy didn't fade. It grew. As the weeks passed after Victor Albright's arrest, something unexpected happened in Grand Rapids. People began to heal in ways they didn't realize they needed. It didn't erase the pain. It didn't erase the years of wondering. But it allowed the community to finally breathe without the weight of an unanswered question pressing on their shoulders. Residents gathered for small memorial events, not to relive the tragedy, but to celebrate the parts of Laura's life that had been overshadowed for too long. Her students from old art workshops brought pieces she helped them restore. Families brought photos of murals she touched. Some brought handwritten notes describing how her kindness once lifted their spirits during difficult moments. Her work lived on through those she inspired. That became her legacy. At the local museum where she once volunteered, a new display was created in her honor. It featured some of the restored pieces she worked on in the early 1970s, each labeled with her name. Visitors came from across the region to see it. Some stood there silently, hands over their hearts. Others whispered that Laura finally received the respect she always deserved. Her family visited the display often. For the first time in decades, they walked through those doors without feeling crushed by the unknown. Instead, they felt something closer to peace, a sense that even though they lost her far too soon, the community now understood her value, her passion, and the beauty she left behind. And for people who never knew her personally, Laura's story became a reminder of why closure matters, why truth matters, why justice matters. Not because it changes the past, but because it helps people move into the future without carrying the weight alone. While the community moved toward healing, one person carried a different kind of relief: Detective Alonzo Vargas. He had retired years before the case was solved, but Laura's file stayed with him like a shadow he couldn't shake. For decades, he wondered if he missed something, if he overlooked a detail, if he could have done more. Every winter reminded him of the night she died. Every anniversary reminded him of a promise he couldn't fulfill. When he heard the news of the arrest, he didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. He simply closed his eyes and let out a breath he had been holding for nearly half a century. His daughter later said she had never seen him sit so still. It was as if the tension in his body finally released piece by piece. He went to the station days later, walking slowly, carrying the same quiet dignity he always had. The younger officers greeted him with respect, showing him the file now complete: the fingerprint match, the DNA chain, the timeline, the wool fibers. Everything that once felt hopeless now stood solid in front of him. Vargas placed his hand on the folder and whispered that this was all he ever wanted for Laura. Not fame, not attention, just truth. That moment wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud, but it mattered. It showed that even when decades pass, justice can still reach those who need it. It showed that patience, persistence, and progress can uncover answers long believed lost. It showed that closure can come late, painfully late, but when it arrives, it brings a kind of peace that time alone cannot create. Laura's case didn't just end, it allowed the people who cared about her to finally be free from the weight they carried for far too long. As the case reached its final chapter, something shifted across Grand Rapids. People didn't just feel relief, they felt wiser, more aware, more protective of one another. The idea that a man could live quietly for decades while carrying a violent secret forced the city to look at safety differently. It reminded everyone that real danger doesn't always move fast or shout loudly. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it blends in. Sometimes it hides behind a gentle smile. The story also spread beyond Michigan. Other communities watched closely, realizing how much modern science can reveal. Families with unsolved cases in their own towns felt a spark of hope. They saw proof that the truth can survive time, even when memories fade, even when evidence grows old, even when the world seems to move on. Laura's legacy lived through the art she restored, the people she inspired, and the truth that finally protected her name. Her story became a message to anyone who ever felt forgotten. Justice can still find you, even years later. Her family carried that message with quiet pride. They no longer had to sit with the fear that the person who took her life would stay hidden forever. They could finally speak about Laura without feeling weighed down by unanswered questions. And for the viewers, the lesson was clear. Some killers stay free because people stop paying attention. Don't be one of them. Subscribe now, and if you still won't, tell us in the comments why. This wasn't just a crime story. It was a reminder that the passage of time doesn't erase truth. It only delays it until the right moment arrives. Laura's case proved that silence can break, secrets can fall apart, and justice can rise even from the coldest places. In Michigan, the snow melted, but the truth did not.